writers always focus on content. We see ourselves as content experts. That's why we always start in that need to tell mode. But we've also got to give our readers context before they can get the content. So remember this sequence. This is the first little mnemonic device for the class. Context, content, conclusion. Give the reader context, then give the reader content, and don't neglect to conclude, which usually means what was the significance? What's the so what of what you have to say? On to the access points themselves. I got this phrase, readers or raters, from a student in an EMBA class. I mean, we don't read workplace documents. We rate them for information. We search for what we need to know to get our work done. And we want to find the information we need as quickly and as easily as possible. So we look for access points that stand out and say, information here. I'm going to illustrate this by looking at several different types of access points and how they work in a paper. Lots of negative examples and then end with a positive example. First thing is to consider just the role of the white space. This isn't such a bad set of instructions here, which you'll probably immediately recognize as being similar to what we did with the paper airplane. I mean, the ones are out here, it's a hanging indent. But compare the white space and the use of it as a reader with this up here, and then, and let me move it down just a little more, this one down here, where we really do a full hanging indent, and we also use something here where the information reads in a parallel fashion. This would be lexical or reading parallelism, and then the visual parallelism is strong as well. Everything looks the same. Notice that it is focused on, pardon me for moving this around, it's focused on the reader. There's an action, and then the thing that is acted upon or that the action creates. It's written to the reader in the reader's context of use. To form, I'm folding the body. To form the nose. Just assume you got to instruction 17, you looked at the nose and you said that doesn't look right. Which would be easier to access if you went back and tried to find the instruction for forming the nose? Certainly this one that makes good use of white space and separating out those parts of the text the reader should see. Same thing in a memo. I mean, my students at the undergraduate level are always having problems with memo. They give me these where there's just one big chunk of text. I can't pull out the information I need. I try to get them to write this, where as you can see, this part of the memo header is actually, these are actually headings. So they are differentiated from the text by being bold-faced and with white space in between. Speaking of headings, here's some particularly bad headings. This one right here, it's the same size as the text. We see it because there's white space around it. But look what happens down here. This space, more space above, less space below, that's the rule of thumb for a heading, is the only thing, that and the fact that this line doesn't come all the way to the end, that allows us to see this heading. Underlining doesn't work for heading. You don't want to use underlining for anything except a third or fourth order heading. That means 3 or 4 orders in. The reason it works there and doesn't work as a first order heading, which it is here, is that by the time a reader gets to a third or fourth order heading, that means they're really very interested and they are going to see it. They're the only ones still reading at that point, the ones who have a strong interest in it. If we go to the second page, you'll see what I mean. See the white space above got left out here. So this thing is, you can see it, but had that line come all the way to the end, you'd never see that heading. So here are some good headings from an audience analysis memo in an EMBA program, and this really dates me back in 1994. Here's the first order heading, a second order heading, and you see this third order heading you don't see it quite as much. It is differentiated as boldface, but the only one who's reading this is somebody who's in the B2 software development team, or really that's what they want to read about. By the time you get to a third order head, that's 2 layers in to the argument. So people who are reading that will see such headings just because they're looking for them at that point. Let's move on. Paragraphs also are visual units. Look at this. Would you like to read this? No. It's a huge brick of text. The first thing we do as an editor is go in here and find some way to break it probably into 4 different paragraphs because notice it actually begins on the page before. When we talk about editing paragraphs, you'll see that we look for a point sentence in a paragraph. More on that later. But for now, let's just say that a good rule of thumb for a paragraph is that it has 5 to 7 lines of text. Not sentences, but lines of text. Of course, you can write a 12-line paragraph or even a 15-line paragraph that's extremely well written, that even reads well. But visually, people are going to see that brick of text coming, and that's going to set them up to think that it's hard to read. If you write 15, 17-line paragraphs, they may be very good, but you run the risk that people simply won't read them when they read your text. Visuals should always be numbered and have captions and should be lined up with their text. That's not true for any of the visuals on these 2 pages. And I'm going to skip to the positive example to sum up so we can close this down. I talked quite a bit about how poorly this is done. It just sits at the end because visuals are always content. If the visual is content, remember context, content, and conclusion. There is no conclusion here. There should be a conclusion that tells us what the significance of this visual is. Why did we have to see it? That's what's really wrong here, is there's just a visual at the end. We do this with visuals such as this, with charts and graphs all the time. See the graph below. End of discussion, and then a new major heading starts. Well, what am I supposed to see in that graph? Tell me. Tell me the significance. So let's look at a positive example of a visual. It's called out in the text above. See figure 4. Down here it has a number and a caption. And a key phrase in the caption is repeated in the text, which assures us that we can find the text if we want to read it that goes with this. These are strategic repetitions. Repetition in that expressivist essay was probably not a good thing, but in a lot of technical and professional writing, repetition keeps the reader on track, and we know when we move from topic to topic. Finally, the samples offer, again, all the way back to 1994. This was written by a technician out at Sandia National Labs, and you'll notice there's almost everything in here. Good use of white space, more space above, less space below headings. Really nice vertical and horizontal parallelism. Everything lines up. You can't mistake that this goes with that. Figures are numbered and they have captions. There's only one thing on here that doesn't quite work out. On the second page it says Memo to Scott Sanders. But what would be useful for me, my context of use, is not that it's to me. Every memo I have on my desk is to me. If I'm missing page 1 and page 2, I have to match it up from the from information. So it ought to have to Scott Sanders from John Q. student, or just memo to Sanders from the last name of the author. That would probably be better. And then the one last thing I want to point out is notice that it does have a conclusion down here. It's a polite conclusion saying, give me a call if you need some help. And I hope you found this brief version of what in class takes about 40 minutes to do of some use.